Welcome to the Excella Civic Innovators podcast, where we talk with government leaders who are transforming how services are delivered. Today is a special episode as we welcome longtime government technology leader Rob Lloyd to the podcast. Together, we'll explore what successful government transformation really takes, from aligning people and processes to building long-term strategies that can adapt to changing priorities and deliver better outcomes for communities. Let's dive into the conversation. Hello and welcome to the Civic Innovators podcast. I am Noel Reininger, the CEO of Excella. So today we have a really special episode. We are introducing our new co-host. Some of you, and frankly, a lot of you in the government technology circles know him really well. It's Rob Lloyd, and he's currently the director for the Center for Digital Government. Rob is a longtime civic leader with over 30 years of experience. Recently, he was the CTO at the city of Seattle, and he was also the CTO and deputy city manager at the city of San Jose. What's really, really exciting about the conversations we're going to have with Rob is he's got the inside view of what it really takes to modernize civic operations, specifically operationally, the technology. He's done it multiple times as an operator, but he's also got this much broader purview now, working with national leaders across the board in his current role as the director for the Center for Digital Government. So we are super excited to have you here, Rob.
Thank you. Thank you.
So start out, one of the great things about this conversation is that you were also a former Excella customer in your role at Seattle. And
multiple times, actually.
Yeah, multiple times. And so it'd be great, and you and I interacted quite a lot in that capacity. As you look back on working with Excella, what stood out the most out of that time?
I'll tell you two things, Noam, and maybe it comes in generations. Number one is underlying all of it was Excella's quest to always be a platform that could give the fundamental want to make an organization, a city, a county, a state, successful in its endeavors to be that administrative system that makes us successful so that you can kind of see things and orchestrate things. And it's had more successful periods and less successful periods, but always that want. And then more recently, as you and I got to work together, the ambition to say, how do you see the kind of that digital exhaust and that where things are working and not working? How do you match that with the ability to do change management? What's in front of us, which is, I think, where you've put some really good thoughts in front. But number two is also what's around the people and what other tools and work processes does Excella sit in the middle of. And there's a lot of kind of like singular plays as a CIO or CTO or deputy city manager has to look at. And the world isn't always that simple. So Excella has done a good job over the years trying to not just see things in a simple lens.
So if we go to things that are not simple, it's permitting processes. And one of the things that I've heard you say is, technology and software alone does not fix, permitting processes. Maybe you can expand on that a little bit.
Yeah. And I think you probably know this as well as anyone from your multiple lives as well as we say, technology is really hard, but it's actually usually the easiest part of the work that we do, because usually you have to start listening really hard and not solving problems, because the problems really are where you identify what's really the matter, what we're really trying to accomplish, and you strip things away first. And then you say, here's how we're going to solve things across problem sets. And maybe I'll go backwards before I go forwards. Because when we take a look at the big problems that are facing us and what permitting and licensing are really trying to solve, it's not that you're just trying to put out a permit or a license or a code violation. You're trying to make a community safer. You're trying to make economic development happen. You're trying to solve homelessness and housing insecurity. And when you start with that premise, you can unify departments. But absent that why, people are just doing the administrivia. And they say my process is what matters, not the outcome or my steps or my control.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you have over 30 years of doing this with the front lines, and I'm
Or 27, 28.
sure 30, bro, many years. You've apparently have scars and lessons. And so, one of the things that you said is really understand the work and understand how the work is interconnected across various departments. And so, for leaders undergoing a modernization effort and they're starting out, they're thinking about new technology and new selection process. What are some of the things you think they really need to understand, on day one? And you started with really unpacking, how the work is getting done. So maybe tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things you have to do with these transformation initiatives is just understand and identify with and respect the deep knowledge and what you're trying to accomplish, because it's three levels that you're trying to work at. One is the operational level of trying to make people's day-to-day work run well and deliver good services. And then managers are seeing things from a different lens, which is how do I do my job of orchestrating things across my staffs, and accomplish the risk management and the legislative and legal requirements that we have. And then you have at a third level, the strategic outcomes that your city council and your mayors and your city managers are saying, we need to take our communities in a good long-term direction. And if you put those three things together, you can really have a really strong conversation with your community and your organization saying, what are we trying to accomplish? And then how do we head in that direction? Where are we now? What are the process and systemic changes we have to make? And then how do we keep on going in a good direction long term? And so we don't view things as kind of one offs. The reason for contesting has to make sense in the broader picture, not just I control this one thing. And then the system questions are putting that context, because the system has to meet that question. You're not answering a system question like it helps us do this one thing. It helps us do this one thing that helps us do this greater thing, and these series of things, and accomplish this broader direction long term. And that's where, to your point, the scar tissue I have is yes, we have some near term goals, but how does it all orchestrate and weave together that we are going in the right long term direction? I think to your question though, also is usually when we set directions, we don't converse first. It's kind of a downward pressure or an emergency that causes us to move. And organizations at their best are more intentional, and more broad reaching about here's what we're trying to do and here's why and here's your part of the process. And in precious few places have I seen the organization actually do that.
That makes a ton of sense. And so now you have this national purview and you're seeing a lot of different municipalities, big and small. What are you seeing that great leaders that are really driving successful transformations, are doing very well to get that strategic alignment, that inclusion, that continuous improvement, happening? What are you seeing as some best practices across the cohort of municipalities that you're talking to?
Yeah, and we had this conversation actually at the large city county CIO summit, for our digital communities. And kind of three patterns that we saw emerge were number one is, the great CIOs are being brought into this conversation where you're not IT and the CIO that's being brought in after the fact, where, hey, we need you to support something that the planning and development director, or the code enforcement director or someone else or the police chief is saying I need, and they're steering, and then you're serving. More and more city managers, mayors, county executives are pulling in CIOs, at least the great ones, very early in that process, saying, you're going to co own this transformation. We need something that can do two things. One, really help us address the housing insecurity, homelessness, affordability issue. And we think our permitting systems play a key role in part of that solution. And business permitting is, we're still reinventing our economies. They don't look and perform the same post COVID, post pandemic. What are the solutions that we can create, and how do we have a platform that can help us with that? And the good ones, the great ones, are being tapped as partners in that. Number 2 is those same people are saying, there's a problem in the moment where, for example, AI might be able to help with something, but that might be a moment. I can't think of that as separate. I need to then weave that in with my platform and my architecture. If I solve it now, it needs to be part of a broader and longer term solution. So we're seeing the great leaders say, all right, if I can solve a timing issue, a recheck issue, a responsiveness issue, how do I do it once? But once is nothing. How do I weave it into my longer term platform approach? And number 3 is they're calling in their partners and saying, if that platform approach is true, and that's my best answer, there's a resourcing ecosystem partner scenario that I have to create.
In terms of folks that are looking, they're feeling that pressure. There's clearly a mandate for speed, modernization. And, you talked about this building this community ecosystem, right? So the ones that do it well, don't do it alone, right? They get brought in early. They're building stakeholders at the city manager level. There's stakeholders with vendors, might be the developer community that's also a stakeholder in getting something done. How have you seen that rolled out in practice so that it has teeth and it really works?
Yeah, and I think actually, and this is probably more of a conversation for us to have known is a lot are still trying to figure that out. Like, what do you build inside your hood, and what are the partnerships that you create? Because other people might come up with some really good ideas. Like I remember one of our first conversations 2 years ago. You kind of filled in some of the picture as I was plotting out what I was trying to do with Seattle. You gave me 2 names that I hadn't heard of before and saying, "Hey, these people are doing good things. Here's our strategy for Excella, but I'm keeping my eye over here." And I'm like, "Oh, I need to check on those." And you're like, "Hey, they are doing pretty good things." But you had a great strategy for saying, "Hey, if we don't do it, here's how we're going to support, and we have a partnership." But to answer your question, I thought you had a really smart strategy of we're going to have native solutions. We're going to have partnerships for how they can play with us, so that the best out there can be Excella partners, and communities can be enabled in a very productive way that makes all 3 better. And that was very promising because it wasn't like, hey, it's our ball and only our ball. And I think that's a very smart way to do it because you're helping communities still achieve their goals, but it's kind of competition. You're learning, you're improving, but you're also making sure that your own product is going well. And then we're all kind of learning together. And then the third thing is the privacy, security, trust piece is so important right now. And some of those companies, those singular plays, have to be grown up companies. And what you can do as Excella versus what some of those can and can't do does come up in some of those contract negotiations. And you can kind of bring a different armament to bear, and be a strong partner in a different way where you can enable an ecosystem as one of the bigs. And I'm kind of I always use this analogy, what separates Silicon Valley versus the ones that tried to create it and couldn't. It's the bigs didn't eat the smalls, and they created the next. And so the ecosystem philosophy is, I think Excella has this special place where you can help create the ecosystem.
I appreciate that. And one of the conversations that's now coming up in every ecosystem discussion is AI. And you can't go to any technology conference or any GovTech technology conference and not hear or not talk about AI and have it be at the forefront. And so from your purview, now that you're working with multiple jurisdictions and municipalities, what are people really getting right? And then what do you believe still needs to be figured out?
But and taking a step back on AI, I think there's 5 types of AI application when it comes to planning, permitting, and development. And I've had this conversation, and I used to have 3, and I split into 5. So one is where AI can really improve the rules and laws, and that's probably one of the most neglected. Is AI is really good at reviewing things and comparing. and that probabilistic regression math behind it, that consumption, the RAG models, wonderful at that. And in Seattle, we did some fun work with the University of Washington Responsible AI Center under Professor Bill Howe. So take a look at all the statutes, take a look at ordinances, take a look at our rules, take a look at our guidances and processes. See where all the laws we've created over the last 20 years conflict, don't match. The next one is conversational bots. You and I are well educated. If we go into our communities and said, "Can I remove marked trees, like tree on our lot?" It's so obtuse, we probably still don't know. But a conversational bot could use plain language and remove accessibility issues of multilingual or just simplicity, and say, "Well, it appears that you could. Would you like to contact staff? Would you like to start the process?" Ease some of those things where access and understandability and plain language are things. AI is good at that language use too. Some development and investment there. What we're seeing, and I'd like to see what your experience has been. 90+% of investment has gone in pre-check submittals. That type of AI tech, really useful, high return, where you can make sure that what's submitted follows archetypes and doesn't have such a high rejection issue, and great for communities and the person, but it goes towards the philosophy of a perfect applicant. There's some value there. The third one, or the fourth one, and I used to merge these two, but they rightfully are two different ones, is the perfect processor. So does the staff process go really where? Where is it getting bogged down? Is it a utility check? Is it a transportation check? And those get bogged down a lot. So why? How do we clean that up? And where can we make the city more effective? Because it's not always the applicant's fault. And then the ease of the process itself for the applicant, because sometimes it's a mom and pop, sometimes it's a really experienced developer. And so AI can mean lots of different things in that development process. Code enforcement, it can mean different things for accessibility and equity versus data insights. In housing, we just had our City Manager Innovation Council, which you guys are a wonderful sponsor of and understand the importance of city managers. But Zillow shared 20+% of the real estate postings they have are vacant lots, but they're not activated to be developed. So could they help change the face of housing and housing insecurity if cities can see those and figure out a way to ready them for development? And so lots of analytics where AI can be a kind of like a transformative force in different ways we've never actually addressed before. So just threw a lot out at you, but AI is something that a lot are looking at, but you have to categorize them because different AI, different tools, different tech, different people to do different things, and we're seeing different investment patterns. Does any of that help though?
Yes, 100% of what you're seeing.
But I'd be curious to know from what you're seeing, because you were one of the most informative conversations I had when we were mapping out the Seattle PACT executive order under Mayor Harrell, where we were starting to make some significant progress on speed and experience. But you gave me some of those insights and on which vendors were actually showing some productive improvement for cities and how you guys are setting your strategy. And what would you share is kind of like the biggest insights?
Yeah, so you went from 3 to 5, and I'm gonna take it back to 3 just to make things look. Government outcomes are complex, right? So you started with the outcome of the permit essentially is economic development and safety, right? If you think about permitting, licensing, et cetera, and there are sometimes dozens of departments that need to come together with not so well-informed constituents and residents and sometimes developer that are interacting with this complex system. And so we're thinking about it in 3 different domains of first, adding velocity and taking out friction. And the first is intake, where I'll take your number 2 and number 3, the conversational bot and the pre-check, which is I want to interact with the government entity that I'm working with in a simple way to help the submittal of whether there's a tree down and it's a service request, or there's a pothole and it's at this specific location, and make that really simple, or I have to submit a multi-permit complex package to get a building plan approved. I think AI has got tremendous potential there, and both on the conversational side as well as the pre-submittal check. And there's an area where that goes together, which is, hey, I've had a conversation with you to get to a deterministic, simple answer of the service that you need, and then I'm checking that your submittal, and that's essentially what comes into the government civic factory, is the raw material, is that submittal request and the plans, make that as clean as possible. And we believe that that'll take a lot of friction out of the process. And that's been our initial focus area, is that first interaction and then the submittal. The second is what you mentioned is, now there's multiple departments that need to coordinate, and it might be the structural engineering department in that review that's really taking the most time. And so if you put in a bot that speeds up the intake, but you have a really small team doing structural reviews, you might still have really long permitting processing times. And so some of the most important things there might not be AI. It's actually insights and KPIs to identify where those bottlenecks are so that the system, and it may just be that it needs to be resourced. Now we are going to add AI to those components as well for simple things like you need to validate that the contractor working on this lot has a valid certificate, right? Those are things that really can be sped up by AI. I think the one area that you touched on a little bit, which is our third domain around regulations. And it's not so much to help cities figure out all of their regulation and which ones may be conflicting or simplify. But the one constant with regulatory environment is change. They will always change. Regulations are going to change. There's going to be new ones. Old ones will be sunset. And new elected officials will come in and they'll have initiatives, and there'll be things like the World Cup and maybe the need for special permit types for a large event like that. And so the third domain of AI, where we think where we're investing and there needs to be, there will be a big impact, is enabling the system to change itself. This is where some of us are experimenting with vibe coding, et cetera, so that as a new regulation happens, from the day that the regulation happens to when it's actually available in workflow is much, much, much faster. And the friction gets taken out of that.
Well, and you and I talked about this, is there should be actually a kind of a policy house where what works really well in kind of what contexts and what doesn't work really well in context, and kind of the research on this as a policy lab really hasn't been there, even though there's billions of dollars each year that are affected by this. So what kind of business permit works really well in a hyper urban, dense community with over 500,000 people versus a small suburban community in the Midwest? And could you package that type of permit or that type of product or business flow? Because not every city is the same, but some of them rhyme. And so there could be some of that really helps some communities accelerate their recoveries. And that does really help people in the long run.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, and AI isn't necessarily the solution because it's really, but it's going to help it accelerate, which is benchmarking. So if you really understand best of the best, and what is the tech, what's the process, what are the permit types, what does a workflow look like for best of the best velocity and the least amount of friction for specific segments of cities in terms of size and potential geography, what does that look like, and where does one city compare to the next, and then how do you get there as quickly
Yeah.
as possible? Well, look, I know we're at time. We are so glad that we had this conversation today. I'm extremely excited to have you as a co-host. We also have our new Accela branding as part of this and our brand refresh. And what we want everybody to know is that we are fully committed to continuing to improve, enhance, modernize, and innovate to speed up, add more velocity to those civic processes, primarily around community development and asset management, and take friction out of the process. Rob, welcome on board. So glad to continue this conversation that we started when we met at Seattle and continue it here. And for all of those that are listening, See you on our next podcast.